here's a picture, a very famous picture that I've used many times of a vernal pool. So it looks a lot like that sequence that you just saw. Shallow water, logs falling across it, canopy of forest overhead. And as you could tell from that sequence of images, it changes with the seasons. Each month it's a little bit different. Sometimes the water is high, sometimes the water is low, sometimes the water is gone. And that's what makes it a vernal pool. Other names for a vernal pool is, excuse me, I'm interrupting myself again. I already turned this off. Other names for a vernal pool, seasonal wetland. Yes? Oh, that was in the way? In the East, they call them wicked big puddles. And they can be big, they can be small, they are transitory. Most people don't even know that such things exist, and they are the most ignored of all of the wetland types. They are the most endangered, they're the most threatened because of lack of information. So many years ago, I started talking to people about vernal pools and how special they are as a type of habitat. And still, people don't know what I'm talking about. So thank you for the opportunity to come here and fill you in a little bit about vernal pools. All right, so let's see. What is a vernal pool? So if you're not a wetland enthusiast like I am, you may not know what vernal pools are. So first, in the broadest sense, it's a kind of wetland. And these are the 3 points that help describe what a wetland is when you're doing technical surveys and try to determine is it or is not a wetland. So it has wetland hydrology. That means that there is water there, usually shallow water. If it gets to be a couple meters high, it's probably not a wetland anymore, it's a pond. So somewhere in between that high and just over your ankles, it is a wetland. It has a source of water. It has hydric soils, which means soils that have been modified because of the water that is there. So hydric soils, you may have to be a soil scientist to do a good job at this, but often what happens is when there's water saturated in soil, it dissolves minerals. Those minerals moved, it creates layers, so you get areas that are maybe red and gray and red and gray. You get that kind of thing, and a soil scientist would recognize that as a soil that has been modified by the presence of water, so it's a hydric soil. So wetlands will have hydric soils, and they have wetland plants. So there are plants that like to be in water or very tolerant of water. So that is usually the easiest thing to recognize. So a botanist may specialize in wetland plants and be able to go out and say, oh, look, there's a button bush growing here. This must be a wetland, because that's where button bushes grow. So they have specific kinds of plants that are indicators of wetlands. When you get all three, you can clearly say this is a wetland, and often that brings in some regulatory measures as far as what can and can't be done with that space. So that's why these definitions have been made, is because there's Environmental Protection Agency and such regulations that influence what you can and can't do with a wetland. So we're going to look at vernal pools, these various things. The surrounding habitat is forest, so that's typical. If it's not forested, that happens a lot with seasonal wetlands further west out in the Great Plains. They're often called prairie potholes because there's no trees, but they are similar in many ways. They are seasonal, especially. So we will look at seasonal hydrology, how water changes from one time of year to the other. We'll take a look at some what geographically isolated hydrology means. This, in legal circles, this has been hotly debated for Well, ever since there was an EPA, I guess. So back to the 70s. What does geographically isolated hydrology mean? Vernal pools also have microhabitat and microtopography. They're uneven. So basically, typically there are shallow and deeper parts, and that makes them complex environments. And that helps add to the diversity of things that live there. So these micro characteristics are very important. Vernal pools have limited predators in the water. So it is much different in its ecology than a pond or a stream would be because of the lack of top-level predators. And there are obligate organisms. That means there are organisms that will only be found in vernal pools. They're not found anywhere else. There are things that are critically dependent. So there are threatened and endangered species that are found in vernal pools that are found nowhere else. So the protection of vernal pools helps to protect these at-risk organisms. So we'll take a look at these. All right, so sometimes they occur on forest edge or in shrubland. Let's take a look at this picture here. So in here, the vernal pool is right in the middle here, that inner yellow circle. And this particular aerial photograph shows a woodland or a shrubland around it, and then it shows the distances. So the blue circle is 100 meters, the red circle is 250 meters around that vernal pool. That's a very important characteristic for the diversity of life that is inside of those waters. Where you have a vernal pool and surrounding woods, a nice woodlot around it, you're going to have a lot more that uses that vernal pool. So many salamanders that use vernal pools for breeding purposes only go to those vernal pools for 2 weeks of the year. They go, they lay eggs, they reproduce, they go back into the woods. Well, if there's no woods for there to go back into, they're not going to be coming to the vernal pool because they spend 50 weeks of the year out in the woods, usually under logs and in the ground, and you never see them. So many of us who monitor vernal pools and want to see the activity, we're looking for that spring flush of salamander activity when they're most exposed and they come to the vernal pools. And that happens in March, often in March around here. For some organisms, they need a woodlot that would include the red circle. So something like a wood frog needs a lot of space. Wood frogs will travel for as much as a mile from where they are over the summer and the winter to their breeding pool in the spring. If they don't have a lot of space, if they don't have a lot of woods, then they can't manage. There's not enough resource for them. And so you won't see them in the vernal pool. So having the pool with complementary habitat around it is critical for many different species. Trees provide leaves, woody debris, and shade. So we're going to see that these characteristics, that woodland canopy is important because we generally refer to vernal pools as the energy comes from detritus. So that may sound a little odd because normally we think of food chains as starting with plants. But most of the energy, most of the food material is from fallen leaves and decaying material that falls into the water. And that's what gets broken down and feeds the food chain. Okay, I'm missing a picture. All right, so like the opening sequence, different times of year, they look different. So here's a vernal pool. You can see a little bit of ice covering that pond. There's snow around there. This is when things really start to happen. I don't know who that is over there. Could be me. So this is really an important characteristic of vernal pools. This is when things really take off. There's still snow on the ground. It's beginning to melt. It's one of those early thaws, still in winter. And snow is melting and draining in and filling up these pools if it's not already full and the ice is melting. If you're out and can explore one of these, if you can get a dip net in there and see what's happening, you will find dozens of different species of organisms that are very active, even sometimes under the ice, if the ice is clear enough that you can see through it. So things are happening very early in the year in vernal pools. One of the reasons is sunlight is able to penetrate the canopy and reach the forest floor because it'll be another month or two before the leaves start to come off. So there is solar energy actually affecting this vernal pool. And because there's no predators, even some of the predators that will show up in here, there are many organisms that are active very early in the year because it's still safe. And that's why some are active even before the ice is fully melted. Sometimes there'll even be salamanders that come and lay eggs while there is ice present.
Question.
Yes?
How deep or how thick does the ice tend to get in a vernal pool?
It can get real thick.
It's top to bottom almost?
Right. So I've gone out under conditions like that, and I say, like, okay, I know it's March. Something's got to be happening here. I get really excited when, the days get to be 2 minutes longer than they were at Christmas time.
Yeah.
So, and I have gone out with a, I'll call it a big stick, trying to break through the ice, and it's impossible. But I've got a dip net, and I've got something to bash through. Sometimes you can just kind of stomp on the ice and fall through. That's one technique. But there are times where that just doesn't work, even if you're bashing it. So yes, when you've got a couple of weeks of temperatures below freezing or down into the 20s, it can come real thick. But the organisms that live there anticipate that. Over thousands of years, they've figured it out. And so it's not harmful. Yeah, any other questions?
Even if it freezes right to the bottom?
Yeah. There are frogs that produce antifreeze. The water in each cell actually moves into the space between the cells so that freezing water doesn't expand and burst the cells open. There's tricks, you don't you don't survive for hundreds of millions of years on this planet if you don't learn a few tricks. And these amphibians have been around for a while. So here, vegetation is beginning to grow. Summer, the same pond. There's almost nothing there but a little bit of mud. It can become quite dry. No apparent vegetation in this. So even in the dry season, even when there is no water present, if you know what you're looking for, you can say, that's a very likely vernal pool. And sometimes it's the plants that are on the edges of this that can tell a botanist that this is a vernal pool, or this is a place that normally holds water, even if it is dry. So there's things like sensitive fern that love the edge of a vernal pool. So if you see sensitive fern, you know that this is an area that is sometimes wet, even if it isn't at the moment. And then fall, maybe it gets even drier in the fall. We've had some dry falls, and sometimes that's when the rains come and they begin to fill up. So even though these are called vernal pools, which indicate springtime, the implication is that, they fill up with water in the springtime with snowmelt. Sometimes they fill up in the fall. It depends. But the important characteristic is that at some point they are dry, whether that's summer or fall. Whether they fill up in fall or winter or spring is not as consequential. But that they dry up at some time, some years, will make it a vernal pool. All right, here's the hydrology. Did they tell you that I'm a former 8th grade science teacher? I used to teach this stuff. So bear with me, there won't be a quiz. All right, so here's water cycle kind of stuff. And an isolated wetland, meaning there's no stream that is a surface water stream flowing in or out of this, is what that isolated part means. Now, is there a groundwater connection to other things? Yeah. Is there wildlife that will go from here to a river or to a pond to other wet areas? Yes. Is there a connection with other bodies of water? Yes. Is it an isolated wetland? You could say that, but it's not necessarily true. And even the Supreme Court hasn't figured that out. So, they're not scientists. So here you see water will flow off, sheet flow over the ground, but not necessarily in a stream, into the wetland. It will soak in. The wetlands in general, vernal pools in particular, will help to recharge aquifers. So if you've got a well and you keep pulling water out all the time, that well is pulling from groundwater, and if all the water just runs right off to the lake, it doesn't have a chance to go down and recharge your well. Wetlands will hold that water in place and allow it to percolate down. So that's what it's showing here. And groundwater discharge can feed in. Groundwater recharge can move water into these substrates so that there's water in your well. But even more, it can soak into rivers. So rivers continue to flow month after month, even during a drought. Where's that water come from? It can be groundwater fed. A lot of times when there's a drought, the Black River stops flowing. It's stagnant in some places because there's not sufficient groundwater to feed into it. So you may not. So it depends on the river, it depends on the rock underneath, it depends on the water table, all those sorts of things. But the wetlands will help to preserve that water table and can make a big difference, even though they're isolated from rivers. They're isolated on the surface, but they can make a big difference in the health and well-being of the rivers because they're contributing to that constant flow even in times when it's not raining. All right, leaves and wood provide food and habitat. So the nutrients come from the trees above. Now this is a curious little picture here. So if you can see what's going on here, you've got a low area here. This is where water would collect. You've got a mossy stump right here and some trees in the back. There's a particular kind of salamander that depends on that exact habitat in order to complete its life cycle. So there's a listed salamander called four-toed salamander. It's kind of a small, diminutive salamander, but it lays its eggs in the moss, not in the water. Most all amphibians lay directly in the water. This lays it in the moss. Well, the moss is moist. It's in a shady location. It wicks moisture up from the vernal pool that it's right next to. So there's enough moisture because amphibian eggs don't have a shell, so they can dry out really easily. They're really dependent on water to complete their life cycle. But the four-toed lays in this kind of hummock just above the water, and then when that egg matures and the tadpole bursts out, it goes plop, takes a swan dive into the vernal pool where it begins to feed on the microorganisms that are in that pool. So this kind of topography and the logs and the hummocks are important for so many different kinds of organisms. If there's trees down, there's places for these organisms to hide. So the more chaotic it looks, the healthier it is in many ways. Often amphibians lay their eggs on sticks. So an amphibian egg mass is just this gelatinous thing that looks a little sticky, and they will find, a dead twig that has fallen into the water. And so there's this anchor point that's just inches below the surface. And they will lay their eggs, and that egg mass will wrap itself around there, and then it doesn't float around. It is anchored in place. That kind of structure within the vernal pool is important for many kinds. I've gone out to vernal pools often, and I'm looking for sticks that are poking out. When it's March or April, I'm looking for a stick. Oh, let's see what's attached to that stick. And quite often, that's where you find what you're looking for. So a great way to survey and find out what kind of organisms are using these pools to breed in is to find those sticks and identify the eggs to species, and then you may know if it's a wood frog or a Jefferson salamander or some other thing that is using that pool for reproduction. And of course the trees are important because they then provide a mellowing effect on these vernal pools. It's not too hot, not too cold, not too windy, and then they shed their leaves. But even more important, I think, if you're out at just the right time in the spring, when the oak trees are in bloom, oak trees are wind pollinated, so they don't have bees carrying the pollen from place to place. They just shed this pollen all over. You can look across one of these vernal pools and see a thick layer of pollen coating the surface. Well, okay, that's not good for the oak tree because they missed their mark. But that's all nutrition. That is gold to the things that are living in the vernal pool. It becomes food very quickly. This is one of the key takeaways about vernal pools. That fish over there is a predator. They're going to eat tadpoles. They're going to eat the bugs. They're going to eat most anything they can get in their mouth. They would be the biggest mouth in the pool if they were there. There's usually no fish in vernal pools because fish can't survive that dry period that vernal pools go through. So that dry period is essential for the ecology of vernal pools. Many of the things that can live nowhere else can't live somewhere else because there are predators. The dry spell of vernal pools eliminates that. Occasionally you'll see what they call a mud minnow. They're not terrible predators. They're short-lived, so there technically could be a fish in a vernal pool, but not a serious predator, and that's not so common. Okay, organisms that require drying or other special conditions found only in vernal pools. All right, so here, buttonbush. One of the first key plant indicators that you're in an area that is wet. So even if it is midsummer and it is dry, this buttonbush, there's the flower of the buttonbush right there, about the size of a ping pong ball with spikes. It loves its feet wet. Now, if you were to dig one up and plant it in a dry spot, it would probably be okay. But they don't prefer that. That's not where they become established naturally. They become established in wet spots, exclusively left to their own resources. So buttonbush is one of those indicators of a wetland or a vernal pool. Salamanders, there's several salamanders closely related to the Jefferson salamander you see there that depend on vernal pools. So there can be easily half a dozen salamanders that depend on vernal pools for breeding. They won't lay their eggs in streams. They won't lay their eggs in ponds. They will lay their eggs in vernal pools away from the fish because the fish would eat the eggs. Predaceous diving beetle. I think I'm losing. That's better. Okay, big beetle. These things can be over an inch long. And that is a top-level predator. They're going to eat a lot of those little critters in there, but not quite as damaging as a fish would be. So they're really pretty cool organisms. They got special hairs on their rear legs, and so when they kick, it makes a good paddle. They have to breathe air, so they come up for air, but they can spend a long time underwater because they carry their own scuba gear. Actually, they trap bubbles of air underneath their elytra, the hard outer wing layer. They trap bubbles under there, along with some hairy structures as well. So the bubble goes down with them. That helps keep them supplied with oxygen while they're chasing critters down. So it is like having their own scuba gear. And fairy shrimp. I have a whole presentation on fairy shrimp. Alone, just them. An indicator of vernal pools. You will find these fairy shrimp nowhere else but vernal pools. It is a true obligate that there's no question. These poor things, they've got 11 pairs of legs. They swim on their back. They are one of the first things to emerge in winter. And to most predators of any kind, these things are juicy. They are, they're very nutritious, which is why they come out first. They will swim around, they will mate, they will lay eggs, and by May, they're done. By the time the tadpoles wake up and say, oh yeah, it's not freezing anymore, and would go after these things, they're gone. So March, April, that's when these things are active. They'll lay a bunch of eggs, and they are so smart. Each year, don't ask me how they figured this out, each year, only about 10% of their eggs will hatch. Why is that? Well, because the hydrology of the vernal pool can be very sporadic. So it may be wet, and then we could have a dry May, and those eggs don't have they dry out.
So fairy shrimp lifespan is just one season?
Yes. So they overwinter as a cyst or an egg. So in order to hedge their bet, only about 10% of the eggs will hatch in any one season. So there can be a really bad season for fairy shrimp for 10 years. There can be really hard luck seasons. And then the right conditions return, everything's fine. And many organisms in vernal pools are adapted to just that kind of strategy, so that even when things, with global warming, where things are going to be weird, they're going to be ready for it in large part. I hope so. We don't know how weird it's going to get, though. All right, here's some other species of vernal pools. So there's turtles, certainly. They can hunker down in the mud. They can walk away. So they've got lots of options if conditions aren't right in the vernal pool. Dragonflies, they often lay, a lot of different kinds of dragonflies lay eggs in vernal pools, and the young, the nymphs are awesome predators underwater. They eat a lot. They're responsible for a lot of mosquitoes never becoming adults. So you can thank dragonflies for that. But they can dry out, and if things are not right for that nymph to mature, They just hunker down, meditate for a season, and then come back the next year. Salamanders, as mentioned before, migrate. They only spend a few weeks at most in the vernal pool to breed. They're not there to feed. They've only got one mission. Then they go back on their own, solitary. The bachelors here and the bachelorettes over there. And they feed.
When you're in the vernal pool, they don't feed?
They're just there to lay eggs and fertilize those eggs.
How far will a salamander travel from the vernal pool?
Half a mile?
Okay.
Yeah.
Because we found them quite a ways away from where
Yeah.
our vernal pool is. So.
Yeah. Well, there's good opportunities for them there,
Yeah.
where you are. Unfortunately, the way the Ohio regulation is for protecting vernal pools is that, they'll send a botanist out and say, okay, where's the vernal pool? Put some flags down where that vernal pool is. And so you find the perimeter of that vernal pool, and then the regulation says, okay, you can't develop that vernal pool, but you can move a foot away, and that's fair game. So it's not unusual to see a protected vernal pool that has no buffer. Only where the hydrology is correct does the regulation have something to say. Doesn't have anything to say with the greater ecology. Okay.
Isn't that the end of the vernal pool?
It's the end of a lot of the biology of the vernal pool, yes. So, yeah, there's the letter of the law, and then there's the spirit of the law. Okay, this is actually a scanning electron microscope image of these little critters here. So you're never going to see these with your naked eye. These are tardigrades. They are really, really small. They will survive anything. You could launch them into space and they'll come back just fine. In fact, I think that's where they came from. But yeah, they can survive a pool drying out unexpectedly. So they estivate, or that's the summer version of hibernation. So lots of different lifestyle adaptations for the critters in vernal pools. All right, so here's the food web, like I taught in 8th grade. And as mentioned, it starts with detritus, which is the dead stuff that has fallen off of the trees, leaves and sticks. That's where the energy and the nutrients begin. And normally I think plants should be at the bottom of the food pyramid. But we're going to stick with this, that it's the detritus, it's the dead stuff. And so there are things that go after the dead leaves and such that are in there. There's decomposers, and those are things like fungus and bacteria, really small single-celled organisms. Decomposers, they work on those things. There are shredders. There are insects that use their mouth parts, and they chew on things, and they consume some of it, but they break it up into smaller pieces. And when you've got smaller pieces, the decomposers can have more access to the tissue, and so there's kind of a feedback between those two. And then there's grazers, things like worms that may just swallow pieces whole. But then even that, their excrement then gets sent back over to the decomposers, and so you've got all of these things working to pull the nutrients out of the dead leaves and sticks. So it's kind of a team effort between all of these to extract this, to change that dead material into something that is alive again. Okay, there is algae, there is photosynthesis going on, especially early in the year when the sun is able to penetrate all the way to the floor, and they can produce a lot of oxygen in that. The cold water of early spring absorbs more oxygen, holds on to that oxygen better than warm water does, so it becomes a very energetic environment for the rest of the critters that are in there, because there's a higher concentration of oxygen in cold water produced through the algae that are there. And I'm still falling off that. And then there's eggs that come in. We often wonder, where do all of these critters come from? How do you start with nothing, and then all of a sudden you've got thousands of different species? Well, the eggs come in. Often they're small enough they can get blown in, or they can come in on the feet of other organisms, turtles and ducks and coyotes that move from one place to the other, and thing gets stuck to their feet and gets moved over. So that's even eggs can provide nutrients into this cycle. So things from outside the system can be brought in. There are filter feeders. That's like the fairy shrimp that just sits there and fans the water all day long and moves water past its throat and is able to consume whatever comes in there. So it has a way of filtering the small organisms out of that water. Deposit feeders are able to grab bigger pieces of food. And then I'm up on the ceiling now. Sorry about that. And then there are predators and parasites, higher level organisms that consume all of this different kind of thing. And what you end up with is a really complex food web, far more complex inside the vernal pool than in the surrounding forest. All right, so it's a complex food web. So where do you find vernal pools? Well, there's probably some in most of the parks around here, if you know what you're looking for. This is a map that was produced by the Ohio EPA to show not specific vernal pools, but where conditions are right, based on a bunch of GIS magic, where conditions are right for vernal pools to occur, so that if you were going to create or mitigate for the loss of vernal pools, these are some of the spots. And so this is there's a GIS map where you can zoom in on all of these little dots and see what's all there. But there's some patterns here that you might notice. The major metropolitan areas are not good places. So, Cleveland and Akron and Youngstown, the Columbus area and Cincinnati, not good places for vernal pools. And the old Great Black Swamp over here, the Maumee River Basin, not a good place because that is highly managed agricultural land. So probably not a good place to go looking to restore vernal pools. But what's really interesting is that this is like the epicenter, this line that goes right across here. That's the Continental Divide. That's the area that is headwaters to all of the streams that flow into Lake Erie, to headwater to all of the streams that flow down to the Ohio River. It's a very shallow continental divide, and so there's not a lot of systems to carry the water off. And that's where it's flat, poorly drained, and the best place for vernal pools. So I think this is Huron County. This is an aerial photo of Huron County. It shows a farm. So here's this little farmhouse here. They've got all this land. And look at the kind of helter-skelter kind of pattern of land use here. So you've got obviously forests, and then you've got some ag land. So the forests here showing a little bit of autumn color here and there. And then you've got this kind of brown and gray ag land right there. And to somebody that understands soils, you look at that, and these gray lines that kind of go through here, and these gray spots, that's an indication of standing water, or that there has been standing water there that has changed the nature of that soil. So that could very well be hydric soil. Well, that tells me that these are really wet woods that are poorly drained, and there's standing water in those woods, more so than in the fields. And that's why they're still woods, because it makes more economic sense. It makes better use of equipment and time if you've got large blocks of land that you can cultivate. But here it's just like working around, where can I find enough well-drained soil that I can plant stuff? And that happens all over Ohio, where you see woodlots, and often woodlots in the middle of an ag field is an indication that you've got poorly drained soil, places that, maybe they just wanted some woods for the resources that are available there, but maybe it's the hardest to cultivate. Maybe it's the areas that have standing water in them for a very long part of the growing season, and that's part of the definition of what a vernal pool is. And then you see ponds here and there where there's little depressions that seem to hold water really well. So this is a typical area here. You can see this arrow points to a dark spot. That very likely is a vernal pool. Here's a more open, no forest canopy here, so that's probably a very, very deep, wet area. There's a pond right there that may have been deepened a little bit, that may have been modified some. But this could very well be what was once a vernal pool over here. But they managed to clear it and drain it well enough. Yes?
If they quit farming that, would that turn back into a vernal?
If they broke the tiles, yeah. If you restore the hydrology, that may be the only thing you need to do to return that to being the natural habitat that it once was. Yeah. So when they do take old farm fields for restoration work in wetlands, that's one of the first things they do, is they look for the drain tiles. Drain tiles last for hundreds of years if they're put in right. They will continue to work for hundreds of years. So you actually have to go in and find them and break them up and interrupt that flow. So that's a first step in restoration.
So when they farm that land, though, they've changed the topography of that, so it would be harder for that vernal pool to return, even if you damaged all of the top.
Well, yeah, it depends on how much they've changed the topography. So sometimes instead of having water removed by underground pipes, the drain tiles, ditches can be built, and that really changes the topography as well. But ditches take up a lot of room, and so you're sacrificing ag space by ditching, and so if you can put a tile, you can farm right over that tile. So that's what you would do if you can. In modern farming techniques. So here's a case study in wetland preservation here. This is the Sawmill Wetlands in northwest Columbus that we were very active in protecting several years ago. So what had happened here, you've got this little bit of green space here surrounded by apartments and commercial areas. Well, what had happened is that as this part of Columbus was being developed, the developer wanted to drain or build right over top of some wetlands. And you can do that, but in order to do that, if you're following the rules, you have to mitigate. You have to either save or restore or create wetlands somewhere in order to compensate for what is being lost. And so that's what was done. So they paved and built the roads and hard surfaces, and then they saved a couple of acres. So there was this that was, at the time, it was considered a Category 3, which is the highest quality level of wetland. And they set that aside and then developed around it. That property got turned over to the State of Ohio Division of Wildlife to manage. The Division of Wildlife really didn't want it, but they got stuck with it because it's only a few acres. Division of Wildlife is interested in hunting providing habitat for wildlife for hunting and fishing. And that really didn't have any potential for that. So it sat there for years, protected in compensation for the development nearby. And then one of the developers said, I've got some friends in high places. I've donated to some campaigns. I'll bet we can nullify the agreement we had on that and build something here. He was almost right. So the neighbors and Ohio Wetlands Association and other groups got active and said, no, let's save the sawmill wetlands. And so committees were formed and political action took place and phone calls were made. Sorry. Not used to talking this way. Am I talking too long? My throat is telling me I'm talking too long.
Longer than an 8th grade class period, that's the trouble.
Yeah, I haven't been in the class enough to. You're right.
Even after all this commercial development around there, did that still remain a Category 3 wetland?
No, it was diminished. So it got, because it didn't have, so yeah. The only salamander that was still breeding in there is smallmouth salamander, which is the most tolerant of all the salamanders to abuse. But there were still fairy shrimp. All right, so vernal pools are naturally occurring, temporary to semi-permanent pools, occupy shallow depressions in forested landscapes. This is just a review. Provide breeding habitat for things like wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and fairy shrimp. Provide habitat for other wildlife, including several endangered and threatened species. Here's my friend David Celebrezzi, who inspired me to care for vernal pools, actually began a program of vernal pool education on his own before Ohio Wetlands Association adopted it. And he is well known for leading hikes at night into vernal pools because, so there he is with a flashlight, because things happen at night that you're not going to see during the day. And if you can get out on that vernal pool in your hip waders and shine a light, fairy shrimp will come to the light, and other things will come to the light. And the salamanders are migrating at night. And so if you're there at the right time of year in the right conditions, magic is happening. So this is his rather poetic description of what a vernal pool is. A mini ecosystem that plays out every spring, a small but dynamic wetland that fills with water, blossoms with life, and hosts a cacophony of sounds and a plethora of life forms every spring, only to disappear into the forest floor every autumn.